This billionaire's mansion had been silent for months until a homeless boy slipped inside. And with nothing but a silly dance, he gave her back what millions could not. What happened next would change all of their lives forever. In the heart of Lagos, Nigeria, where glass towers stand beside crowded markets and the streets never truly sleep, there was a mansion unlike any other. Behind the guarded gates of Ikoyi Estate, one of Africa's wealthiest neighborhoods, lived a man who seemed to have everything the world could offer. David Okoro, an oil magnate whose empire spanned shipping, construction, and real estate, was known by business headlines as the man with the Midas touch. Yet behind the gold-plated doors and marble halls, his home was not filled with joy. It was haunted by silence. David had once been a husband and a father who laughed loudly and without care. His wife, Amina, was the love of his youth, a woman whose smile was as radiant as the Lagos sunrise. Together, they had one daughter, Zuri. She was 8 years old, full of energy, chasing butterflies in the garden, singing to herself in Swahili and English. Her laughter used to echo through every corridor of the Okoro mansion. But then, tragedy came like a storm with no warning. A car accident shattered everything. Amina was killed instantly, and Zuri survived. But her body was left broken. She could no longer run, no longer stand. She sat in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the waist down. From that day, David Okoro's empire of wealth became meaningless to him. He spared no expense trying to heal his daughter. He flew her to the best hospitals in Germany, India, and the United States. He hired world-class physiotherapists, neurologists, and specialists. Each time he returned with hope in his chest, only for it to be crushed again. Nothing worked. Now Zuri sat in her wheelchair by the wide windows of the garden. She rarely spoke. She hardly smiled. Her once bright eyes looked as if they belonged to an old woman tired of life before it had truly begun. And David, though outwardly strong, carried a heartbreak that gnawed at him every night. The mansion was quiet, too quiet. And yet, on an ordinary afternoon under the Lagos sun, something unexpected happened. Zuri sat in the garden, the heat of the day pressing against the earth. Her nanny had rolled her wheelchair to the shade of a mango tree. She was staring at the iron gates, her mind far away, when she caught a glimpse of movement. A boy, barefoot and ragged, slipped into view. His clothes were torn, his hair unkempt, his knees scraped from life on the streets. He didn't belong in Ikoyi. He belonged to the chaos of Oshodi bus terminal, where abandoned children like him found corners of unfinished buildings to sleep in. But in his eyes there was something: mischief, light, determination. Without saying a word, he began to move. His arms swung wildly. His steps were exaggerated, his body twisting and tumbling in a rhythm that was clumsy, yet alive. It was not the polished dance of a trained performer. It was raw, silly, almost ridiculous. At first, Zuri just blinked. But then, for the first time in months, a sound escaped her lips. A giggle. The boy widened his eyes, pretended to slip, then caught himself with a dramatic flourish. Zuri's hands clapped together. And then it happened. Her laughter burst out, pure and unrestrained, echoing across the once silent mansion grounds. The boy grinned and danced harder. And high above, standing on the balcony, David Okoro froze. He hadn't heard his daughter laugh since the day of the accident. Now a barefoot boy from the streets had done what no doctor, no therapy, no amount of money had achieved. It was the beginning of something none of them could have imagined. The days inside the Okoro mansion stretched long and heavy.
like shadows that never lifted. Outside the gates, Lagos buzzed with life, hawkers shouting by the roadside, yellow Danfo buses weaving through traffic, radios blasting Afrobeat into the humid air. But inside the tall white walls of the estate, silence reigned. Zuri Okoro, once the liveliest child in her neighborhood, now lived as though frozen in time. Her wheelchair had become both her seat and her prison. Every morning, her nanny rolled her from her bedroom into the garden, where she sat beneath the mango trees, staring without expression. She watched the butterflies she once chased, but her hands did not reach for them anymore. She watched the clouds, but her lips never sang the silly songs she used to make up. It was as if the accident had stolen not only her legs, but her spirit. Inside the house, the staff moved quietly, their voices hushed. Nobody dared to laugh too loudly. They whispered in the kitchen, glanced at Zuri with pity, and then looked away quickly. Even the house itself seemed changed. The fountain in the courtyard still splashed, but the sound felt hollow. The long marble hallways echoed with footsteps, not laughter. David Okoro noticed it all. He noticed the way his daughter's shoulders slouched deeper every day, how her hair lost its natural bounce because she no longer cared to let her nanny braid it. He noticed how the dolls and books in her room sat untouched, gathering dust. He had tried everything a man of his wealth could try. He had flown her to Europe, America, India. He had paid doctors who charged more in a week than most Nigerians earned in a year. He had brought home machines, therapies, even spiritual healers. Each time, he carried a spark of hope. Each time, the spark died. Zuri did not improve. Instead, she retreated. Her voice grew softer. Her eyes lost light. She rarely called her father Papa anymore. At dinner, when David sat across from her at the long dining table, she ate silently, lifting food to her lips without looking at him. Sometimes she left her plate untouched altogether. For David, these dinners were torture. He was a man who could silence boardrooms, command oil contracts, and negotiate billion-dollar deals. Yet here, in his own home, before his only child, he felt powerless. No amount of money could buy the sound of her laughter again. At night, he often sat alone in his study. The grand room smelled faintly of leather-bound books and old cigars. On the wall hung photographs of better days, Amina's gentle smile, Zuri running barefoot through the garden with her hair flying in the wind. He poured himself a glass of brandy, but the drink never warmed him. He would look at the photos, at the evidence of joy that once lived in his house, and whisper under his breath, "God, give her back to me. Just her smile, just her joy." But each morning, when he opened the door to Zuri's room, he was met by the same blank stare. She would sit by the window, her small frame swallowed by the wheelchair, her hands limp on the armrests. Her doctors explained it clinically: depression, trauma, neurological damage. They used words that made sense on paper but meant nothing to a grieving father. What he saw was simple. His daughter was disappearing. One particular afternoon painted the reality in cruel strokes. Zuri sat in the garden, her nanny beside her, while the house staff trimmed the hedges and swept the driveway. Children's laughter floated faintly from the street outside, kids playing soccer on the dusty road. Zuri watched them through the iron bars of the gate. A ball bounced too far, landing just outside the estate wall. The children laughed, scrambled after it, then ran off still shouting with joy. Zuri didn't smile. She just lowered her gaze, her hands tightening on the armrests of her chair. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she said nothing. Her nanny, heartbroken, reached to wipe it, but Zuri turned her face away. She did not want comfort. She wanted what she could never have again. It was moments like this that crushed David the most. He often watched from his balcony, unseen, as his daughter sat with her sadness. The weight of it pressed on his chest until he thought he might suffocate. He would grip the rail, close his eyes, and feel the bitter truth. He was a man who conquered industries, yet failed at the one thing that mattered most, bringing back the light in his little girl's eyes. The Okoro mansion had become a palace of silence, a fortress of sorrow, and for David, every passing day deepened the fear that the silence would last forever. But fate, unpredictable and often merciful in strange ways, was about to intervene.
The sun hung low over Ikoyi estate, casting long shadows that stretched across the manicured lawns and polished driveways. Inside the high gates of the Okoro mansion, silence lay heavy as always. But just beyond those gates, the city lived another life, restless, chaotic, and unforgiving. There, among the bustling markets and the roar of Danfo buses, lived a boy named Taye. Nobody knew his last name, or if he even remembered it himself. His life had been a patchwork of abandoned places and fleeting kindnesses. He slept where he could, under the rusted skeleton of unfinished buildings, curled up behind kiosks that shut down at night, or tucked into the corners of Oshodi bus terminal, where the air always smelled of exhaust fumes and fried plantain. Taye had no family that anyone had seen, no mother to call his name, no father to tell him right from wrong. What he did have was a gift that kept him alive, movement. When hunger gnawed at his stomach and sleep refused to come, he danced. When drivers shouted at him for begging at the traffic lights, he spun in circles and made silly faces until they laughed despite themselves. Sometimes they gave him coins, sometimes they didn't. But when he danced, the emptiness inside him felt lighter. His body became his voice, his steps became his armor. That afternoon, after a day of wandering with no food in his belly, Taye found himself drifting toward the wealthier side of Lagos. He didn't belong there. The mansions of Ikoyi stood tall, surrounded by hedges and guarded gates. But curiosity often led his feet where hunger could not. Through a narrow gap in the hedge of the Okoro estate, he caught sight of a girl. She was sitting in a wheelchair, her small face resting on her palm, her eyes fixed on the ground. Her hair, neatly braided by careful hands, framed a face that looked far older than her years. She wasn't laughing like the children in the streets. She wasn't playing. She was simply there, silent like a flower that refused to bloom. Taye's chest tightened. He knew that look. He knew what it felt like to be unseen, unwanted, weighed down by sadness too heavy for a child to carry. He hesitated, glancing left and right. The gates were tall, the guards nowhere in sight. His mind raced. If I step inside, I might get chased, maybe even beaten. He had learned early that the rich didn't want street boys near their walls. But then he thought, if I dance for her, maybe she'll smile, maybe she'll laugh, and maybe, just maybe, she won't feel as alone. So with a deep breath, Taye slipped quietly through the hedge and onto the manicured grass of the garden. At first, the girl didn't notice him. She was lost in her thoughts, staring at the dirt near her feet. But then he took a wide step forward, puffed out his chest, and began to move. His dance wasn't elegant. His steps were exaggerated, his arms swung like a clown, his face stretched into silly expressions. He twisted, tripped on purpose, caught himself dramatically, and rolled across the lawn as if he were performing on a grand stage. The girl's eyes flickered toward him. She blinked. And then, softly, timidly at first, she giggled. Encouraged, Taye made his eyes wide, pretending to fall flat on his back before bouncing up again. The giggle grew louder. Her hands clapped together, and then, like a miracle, she laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the forced sound of someone humoring a fool. It was real, pure, and unrestrained, a laugh that had been locked away for too long. Taye's grin widened. He spun faster, hopped on one leg, stuck out his tongue, and crossed his eyes until the girl laughed so hard her shoulders shook. For Taye, it was victory greater than finding bread after a long day of hunger. For those few minutes, he wasn't a street boy. He wasn't starving. He wasn't invisible. He was simply a child bringing joy to another child. What neither of them knew was that high above on the balcony of the mansion, David Okoro stood frozen. He had rushed to the window the moment he heard the sound, his daughter's laughter. It had been months since he'd last heard it, months since that sweet sound had filled his home. His chest tightened as he leaned against the railing, watching in disbelief. There, in his own garden, was a ragged, barefoot boy spinning, falling, making faces, and Zuri, his silent daughter, was laughing, clapping, alive. David's first instinct was fury. Who let this boy inside? Where are the guards? What if he's dangerous? His fists clenched. He nearly yelled to have the boy thrown out immediately. But then he looked at Zuri again. Her cheeks were flushed. Her back, usually slouched, was upright. Her eyes, once dull, now shone with excitement. And her laughter, loud, uncontrollable, poured into the air like music. David's anger faltered. He stood hidden behind a marble pillar, watching, his heart twisting with something he hadn't felt in months. Hope.
The sound startled the staff inside the mansion. It began as a giggle, light as a bird's wing, then grew into a bright, ringing laughter that carried across the garden. For months, the halls of the Okoro estate had known only silence and whispers, but now the air itself seemed to vibrate with joy. It was Zuri Okoro laughing. Her nanny, who had been trimming flowers nearby, dropped her shears in shock. The guards at the gate exchanged glances, wondering if they had heard correctly. One of the housemaids, walking through the corridor, stopped in her tracks and pressed her hands to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. No one had thought this sound would ever return. In the garden, Zuri clapped her hands together as Taye spun in wild, uncoordinated circles. His bare feet slapped against the grass, his skinny arms flailed like a puppet's, and his wide eyes crossed dramatically until he stumbled over his own steps. She laughed harder, her cheeks glowing red. Her laughter came in waves, each one louder than the last, bursting through the walls of grief that had surrounded her for so long. Taye felt his heart race with each sound. This was not the laughter of pity. It was not the polite smile strangers sometimes gave him when he danced in the streets. This was real. This was victory. He dropped to the ground, rolled dramatically, then leapt up as if a string had pulled him into the air. Zuri clapped faster, her hands smacking together with more strength than her nanny had seen in months. And then something even more astonishing happened. Her back, usually slouched, straightened. Her arms, once weak from disuse, waved in rhythm with Taye's exaggerated movements. Her eyes sparkled, alive with mischief. It was as if her spirit had leapt from the prison of her body, following Taye's every move. High above from the balcony, David Okoro gripped the marble rail with trembling hands. His chest rose and fell quickly, his eyes locked on his daughter. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. For months, he had spent millions, surgeries in Germany, therapies in India, specialists flown in from the United States. Each visit ended the same: disappointment, silence, despair. He had resigned himself to the idea that joy had abandoned his home forever. And now, in less than 10 minutes, a barefoot boy with torn clothes had brought it back. His first instinct had been anger. He had nearly called the guards, nearly shouted to drive the intruder away. But now his fists unclenched. His breath caught in his throat.
The rage that had boiled within him drained, replaced with something softer, something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Still his mind wrestled with itself. How could this boy do what doctors could not? What magic was this? Was it dangerous to let him near her? Yet every time he looked at Zuri's glowing face, his doubts weakened. He had not seen her this alive since before the accident. Taye, unaware of the man watching from above, gave one final flourish. He leapt, spun, and landed flat on his back, sticking out his tongue as if defeated by gravity itself. Zuri laughed so hard she nearly toppled forward in her chair. Then silence fell, brief but powerful. The kind of silence that comes not from emptiness, but from fullness, when there are no words strong enough to contain what has just happened. Zuri's small voice broke it. "Again," she whispered, her smile wide and unshakable. Taye grinned, his chest heaving from the effort, but his eyes alight. "Tomorrow," he said, tapping his chest dramatically. "If I do more now, I might collapse forever." She laughed once more, softer this time, but it was enough. From the balcony, David Okoro stepped back into the shadows, unable to move. His heart, heavy for so long, now raced with a strange mix of confusion and gratitude. He did not yet understand it. He did not yet trust it. But he knew one thing with certainty. His daughter had laughed, and that laugh was priceless. That night, long after Zuri had been wheeled back into her room, the sound of her laughter still echoed in David's mind. He sat alone in his study, staring at the portraits of Amina and the child they had once raised together. His hand shook as he poured a glass of brandy. He could still see Zuri's flushed cheeks, her bright eyes, her clapping hands. He lifted the glass to his lips, but found his throat too tight to swallow. For the first time in months, he whispered, not in despair, but in awe, "Thank you, whoever you are."
The next afternoon, Zuri was wheeled into the garden as usual. But this time, her eyes were not distant. They flickered toward the gate with a spark of anticipation. Her nanny noticed the change immediately. "What are you waiting for, Zuri?" she asked softly. Zuri only shrugged, but her hands fidgeted with the blanket draped over her lap. And then he came. Taye slipped through the hedge again, quick and quiet. His clothes were the same, torn shirt, shorts hanging loosely from his thin frame. But his grin was wider, brighter. He raised his arms in mock grandeur, as though stepping onto a royal stage. "Ready?" he asked, bowing dramatically. Zuri's laughter burst out before he had even moved. She clapped eagerly, her eyes alive. But before he could begin, a deep voice thundered across the garden. "Stop!" Both children froze. David Okoro had stepped out onto the grass, his imposing figure casting a long shadow. His face was stern, his eyes sharp. Taye stiffened, his instinct screaming at him to run. He knew that look. It was the look adults gave street boys before they were shoved, kicked, or chased away. I didn't come to take anything, sir," he stammered quickly. "I only wanted to make her laugh." Zuri's voice, small but desperate, cut in. "Papa, please, don't send him away, please!" David looked at his daughter. Her cheeks were flushed, her back straighter than he had seen in months. Her eyes, those tired eyes, were glowing. He felt his resolve falter. "What is your name?" he asked. "Taye," the boy said, steady now. "Where do you live?" Taye swallowed. "Anywhere. Sometimes Oshodi bus terminal, sometimes under the bridge." Zuri's hands tightened on her chair. "Papa, he makes me happy." David studied the boy more closely. The torn shirt, the scars on his knees, the hunger in his thin frame, but also the steadiness in his eyes. Not arrogant, not weak,
simply steady. Finally, David exhaled. You can stay, but only here, in the garden, from 4 to 6. No misbehavior. Do you understand? Taye's face lit up with relief. Yes, sir, I understand. He turned to Zuri, grinned, and whispered, Showtime? Zuri clapped, and once again the garden became a stage. 1 day turned into 3. 3 turned into a week, and soon it was routine. At 4 o'clock sharp, the guards were told to let the boy through. By 6, he was fed and escorted out. Each day, Taye arrived with something new. One afternoon, he spun in dizzying circles, pretending to be a top gone out of control. Another day, he acted out a quarrel between Danfo drivers, his high-pitched voice mimicking passengers, his deep growl copying angry conductors. He made sound effects, tripped dramatically, crossed his eyes until Zuri laughed so hard she nearly tipped from her chair. But it wasn't just laughter. Something else was happening. Zuri's hands, once weak, grew stronger from clapping. Her arms lifted higher, mimicking Taye's wild moves. She gave him commands, "Do it like yesterday," or "Spin again," her voice growing louder, her confidence returning. Some days she even tried to wheel herself in small circles, spinning her chair as if joining his dance. Her nanny reported these changes to David, who listened silently. But he didn't need reports. He was watching, always watching. He noticed the little things, how Taye never asked for anything before performing, how he checked Zuri's face before each joke, adjusting if she seemed tired, how when food was offered, he ate slowly and gratefully, as though savoring every bite. In the evenings, after Taye left, Zuri spoke more than before. "Papa, did you see when he pretended to be a police siren?" Or, "Today I felt something in my toes." And the most frequent, "Papa, can he come again tomorrow?" David found himself smiling more often. He tried to hide it, but the staff noticed. The mansion once shrouded in sorrow now echoed with the sound of Zuri's laughter, bouncing off marble walls that had grown too quiet for too long. One evening, during a routine checkup, the doctor examined Zuri and frowned, not in worry, but in surprise. He said, "Her engagement is back. Motivation like this can spark recovery pathways. We can't always explain it, but whatever you're doing, keep it." That night, David stood alone in the garden, the place where Taye danced. The grass still bore the marks of the boy's bare feet. For the first time in a long while, David did not feel cursed by his wealth. He felt grateful. He whispered into the night air, words he never thought he would say. "Thank you, boy." And though no one heard it, the garden itself seemed to nod in agreement.
At first, David Okoro had allowed the boy to stay only out of desperation. He told himself it was temporary, a harmless distraction for Zuri, nothing more. But as the days unfolded, his perspective began to shift in ways he never expected. David had always been a man of control. In boardrooms, his voice was law. On construction sites, workers scrabbled when his car pulled up. He had risen from modest beginnings to sit among Africa's wealthiest men, and he carried that authority like armor. Yet here, in his own garden, he found himself undone by a barefoot boy whose only possession seemed to be joy. Every afternoon, David would find a quiet place to watch. At first, he stood on the balcony, hidden by marble pillars. Later, he found himself moving closer, sitting beneath the shade of a tree, pretending to read a newspaper, while his eyes lingered on Zuri and Taye. He noticed details. The way Taye always looked at Zuri before attempting a new move, gauging her energy and mood. The way he never once asked for money, though his ribs showed clearly beneath his thin shirt. The way he accepted food without greed, eating slowly as though every bite was a blessing. One evening, after Taye had left, David sat at the dinner table with his daughter. For months, these dinners had been silent, heavy affairs. But that night, Zuri leaned forward, her eyes bright, and said, "Papa, did you see when he pretended to be a goat? He even crawled on the grass." She laughed again, the sound light and unforced. David felt something loosen inside him. He didn't laugh out loud, but the corners of his mouth lifted, just slightly, enough for Zuri to notice. "You smiled, Papa?" she whispered, almost in awe. David lowered his eyes to his plate, embarrassed, but the truth burned in his chest. He had forgotten what it felt like to smile. One night, long after Zuri had gone to bed, David wandered the halls of his mansion. The portraits of his late wife, Amina, hung on the walls. In one, she held Zuri as a baby, her laughter frozen in paint. David stopped in front of it, staring for a long time. "My love," he whispered, "you wouldn't believe what happened today. Our daughter laughed. She laughed, and I didn't even recognize the sound at first." His throat tightened. It wasn't the doctors. It wasn't the money. It was him. He thought of Taye, ragged clothes, scarred knees, eyes too steady for a boy his age. A boy the world would call worthless, yet who had given his daughter something priceless. That night, David did not touch the papers on his desk. The contracts, the phone calls, the deals. None of it mattered. All he could think of was the barefoot boy who danced like the world had not broken him. As weeks turned into a month, the changes in David grew more obvious. The staff whispered about it among themselves. He no longer barked orders with sharp impatience. He lingered in the garden instead of locking himself in the study. He asked his chef to prepare extra meals, enough for Taye to eat heartily before he left each day. One afternoon, David called his head of security. "From now on," he said firmly, "the boy is to be allowed in without delay, 4 to 6 o'clock, every day, and no one is to harass him." The guards exchanged surprised glances, but obeyed. Even his business partners began to notice a difference. During meetings, when tempers flared, David's responses were calmer, more measured. A rival once accused him of going soft. David didn't reply with anger as he once might have. Instead, he thought of Zuri's laughter, of the way Taye bowed dramatically at the end of each silly routine. For the first time, he understood that strength wasn't always in power. It was sometimes in gentleness. Yet the most profound change was internal. For months, David had carried a sense of failure. He had believed his wealth was a shield against suffering. When that shield cracked, leaving him helpless to heal his daughter, his pride had hardened into coldness. But now, watching Zuri come alive again, he realized the truth. Money had never been the highest power. It was kindness. And that kindness had come from the most unexpected place, a boy with nothing. One evening, as the sun dipped low, David found himself standing in the garden after Taye had left. The grass still bore the imprint of small, bare feet. The air still seemed to hum with Zuri's laughter. David closed his eyes, lifted his face to the warm Lagos breeze, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He whispered into the quiet, as if to the stars above, "Maybe I don't need to understand. Maybe it's enough to believe." For the first time in years, David Okoro did not feel like the richest man in Lagos. He felt like a father rediscovering his heart.
The afternoon began like any other. The sun stretched golden light across the garden of the Okoro mansion, and Taye was already in full performance mode. He shuffled in slow motion, his arms jerking like a broken robot, his face twisted in exaggerated concentration. Zuri clapped, giggling so hard she nearly dropped the blanket resting on her lap. David watched from the veranda, arms folded, though his eyes betrayed a softness that would have shocked his business rivals. The mansion that once echoed with silence now pulsed with laughter almost every evening. but none of them knew that this day would be different. "Wait!" Zuri said suddenly, still breathless from laughing. Her small voice carried a determination David hadn't heard in months. Taye paused mid-pose, one leg in the air, his eyes wide. "What is it?" I want to try something," she said. Her hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. The garden fell silent. Even the guards by the gate leaned in unconsciously, sensing something was about to happen. David's heart lurched. "Zuri," he said carefully, his voice trembling, "don't push yourself." But she shook her head. "No, Papa, I want to try." Her tiny fingers clenched harder on the wooden armrests. She took a deep breath, her face tightening with effort. For a moment, nothing happened. Her body trembled under the strain. Then, slowly, her shoulders lifted, her chest rose, and to everyone's astonishment, her hips shifted forward. Inch by inch, Zuri pushed herself upward. Her legs, fragile from months of disuse, trembled like leaves in the wind. "One," Taye whispered, dropping to his knees beside her, his eyes wide with encouragement. "Two," found himself counting, his voice breaking as tears welled in his eyes. "Three," Zuri gasped, her face flushed, her arms shaking violently, and then she was standing. Not tall, not steady, but upright, her feet pressed against the ground, her body trembling, yet undeniably standing. For 3 long seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. The guards froze, mouths open. The housemaids at the veranda clasped their hands, tears streaming freely. And then Zuri collapsed gently back into her chair, panting but smiling through the sweat and tears. "I stood," she whispered. Then louder, her voice cracking with joy. "Papa, did you see? I stood!" David fell to his knees beside her, his vision blurred with tears. He cupped her trembling hands in his own. "I saw, my love, I saw, and I have never been prouder." Taye let out a triumphant shout, spinning in dizzying circles before collapsing to the grass, laughing and crying all at once. "Champion!" he cried, pumping his fists in the air. "You are a champion, Zuri! You are a champion!" The garden erupted in applause. Even the guards clapped, their stern faces breaking into wide smiles. For the first time in years, the Okoro mansion did not feel like a tomb of silence. It roared with joy, with life, with possibility. That night, David sat by Zuri's bedside as she slept, her chest rising and falling peacefully. He touched her forehead gently, whispering, "You are so brave. Your mother would be so proud." He stepped out into the hallway and found Taye sitting quietly on the back steps, hugging his knees. The boy looked uncertain, as though afraid he had overstepped by pushing Zuri too far. David sat down beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then David said softly, "Do you know what you did today?" Taye looked down. "She stood, but it wasn't me, sir. It was her." David's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "No, Taye, it was both of you. She believed she could because you believed she could. You gave her something no doctor, no money, no therapy has ever been able to give her." Taye tilted his head, puzzled. "What's that?" "Hope," David said simply. The word hung in the air, heavy with truth. For the first time, David rested his hand gently on Taye's thin shoulder. It was not the gesture of a billionaire to a beggar. It was the touch of a father acknowledging a son. And in that moment, something shifted. The Okoro family was no longer just father and daughter. It had grown to include a boy who once thought he belonged to no one. From that day forward, nothing in the mansion felt the same. Zuri began asking each morning, "Papa, what if I try again today?" Taye responded with endless encouragement, turning every exercise into a game, every effort into a celebration. David, once skeptical, now looked forward to those hours as much as Zuri did. His daughter had taken her first step towards recovery, and it had begun not with medicine, not with science, but with laughter and dance. The miracle had started.
News travels fast in Lagos. By the end of that week, whispers had already begun to spread beyond the walls of the Okoro estate. A billionaire's daughter, once paralyzed, was laughing again. She had even stood for the first time in months. And the miracle, people said, had nothing to do with doctors or foreign hospitals. It was because of a street boy. At first, the story spread in fragments among the house staff who shared it with neighbors, among guards who couldn't keep their amazement to themselves. Soon, journalists picked up on it. Headlines blazed across newspapers on online feeds. Oil magnate's daughter finds healing through homeless dancer. From Oshodi streets to Ikoyi mansion, the boy who brought back laughter. Public opinion exploded. Some hailed David Okoro as a man of compassion. Imagine a billionaire letting a boy from the streets into his home, they said. It shows real courage. It shows he has a heart. But others were less kind. Critics in Lagos's elite circles sneered at the idea. At a private dinner, one businessman leaned close to David and whispered, "You are ruining your reputation, my friend. Bringing a street urchin into your mansion? What if he steals from you? What if he disgraces you?" Another added, "Your business partners are worried. Investors don't want scandal attached to your name." David listened in silence. In the past, such words would have stung, perhaps even swayed him. His image had always been carefully curated, the powerful mogul, the untouchable figure of wealth. But now, when he thought of Zuri's laughter, of her trembling legs pushing her upright, of Taye spinning in joy beside her, reputation felt like dust. At home, Zuri had her own response to the whispers of doubt. One evening, when a visiting relative suggested cautiously that Taye might not be a good influence, she cut him off sharply. "If you don't like Taye, then you don't love me," she said, her voice stronger than anyone had heard in months. The room fell silent. No one dared argue with her. Still, the attention grew. Photographers lingered outside the estate gates, hoping for a glimpse of the unlikely trio, the billionaire, his daughter, and the boy from the streets. Some tabloids framed it as a heartwarming miracle, others as reckless sentimentality. One Sunday morning, the family attended church. For years, David had sat in the front pew, solemn and distant, a symbol of wealth and authority. But that day, when he walked in with Taye at his side and Zuri wheeling herself proudly beside them, murmurs rippled through the congregation. Some smiled with admiration. Others shook their heads in disapproval. The pastor, catching sight of them, paused mid-sermon and said simply, "Sometimes God sends angels in unexpected forms." Taye's eyes widened at the word angel. No one had ever described him that way. For so long, he had been treated as invisible, or worse, as trash. Now here he was, standing beside a billionaire's daughter, being called something holy. Of course, not everyone accepted the change so easily. One evening, David received a call from a longtime business associate. "David," the man said sternly, "this boy is a liability. If you want to play charity, donate money, build an orphanage, but don't bring the streets into your home. It will stain your family's name." David's response was calm, but his words cut sharper than any boardroom retort. "My daughter is standing again. My daughter is smiling again. That is the only name I care about." The line went quiet. The conversation was over.
Meanwhile, among ordinary people, Taye became a legend. Street vendors in Oshodi shook their heads in disbelief when they heard the tale. That boy? The one who used to dance for coins near the bus park? He's living in a mansion now? Some mocked, others cheered. Mothers pointed him out to their children. See, even someone with nothing can bring joy. Don't ever think you are worthless. Taye, however, cared little for the gossip. Each day, he still arrived at the estate at 4 o'clock sharp. He still danced with the same silly faces and wild spins. He still laughed with Zuri as if the world outside the garden did not exist. But David knew the world was watching, and he understood something now. His choices were no longer about image or power. They were about legacy, not the kind measured in bank accounts, but the kind measured in lives touched. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the Lagos sky in shades of orange and crimson, David stood at the garden's edge, watching his daughter spin her wheelchair in wobbly turns while Taye cheered. Neighbors' whispers, journalists' headlines, businessmen's criticisms, they all seemed to fade in that moment, because before him stood the only truth that mattered: a little girl learning to live again, and a boy who had turned grief into laughter. And David knew, with unshakable certainty, that no amount of scandal, no threat to his reputation, could ever make him turn back.
The Okoro mansion, once a palace of silence, had transformed. Morning light no longer revealed a house of grief, but one alive with noise. Clattering dishes from the kitchen, staff laughing softly in the hallways, and above all the sound of Zuri's laughter, echoing through the rooms like a song reborn. Each day began with the same ritual. At dawn, Zuri asked, "Papa, will Taye come today?" And by 4 o'clock, the barefoot boy who once slept in Oshodi bus terminal arrived at the gates of Ikoyi estate, not as an intruder anymore, but as family. Together, Zuri and Taye turned the garden into a stage. She clapped, while he spun in silly circles. She shouted instructions, while he acted out quarrels between bus conductors. And slowly, she joined the performance herself, first by raising her hands, then by wheeling herself in wobbly arcs, and eventually by standing, longer, stronger, steadier each time. Her doctors were astonished. "This motivation," one said during a checkup, "is beyond what medicine alone can do. It is joy, it is spirit, and spirit can heal the body in ways we do not fully understand." For David, the change in his daughter was a miracle, but the change in himself was just as profound. No longer did he measure his worth in oil contracts or boardroom victories. His wealth, he realized, meant little compared to the sight of his daughter taking shaky steps across the garden, her small hand clutching Taye's for balance. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted Lagos sky with streaks of fire, David called Taye to sit with him. The boy hesitated, unused to being addressed like an equal. "Tell me about yourself," David said. At first, Taye resisted. He had spent years hiding his story, convinced no one wanted to hear it. But David's eyes were steady, patient. Slowly, haltingly, the words came. "My mother died when I was little. My father left. So women at the market fed me sometimes, but when I grew older they stopped. I stayed with boys at the bus station. We sleep under bridges, in shops if they're empty. If we dance, people laugh. Sometimes they give coins, sometimes they don't." David listened without interruption. His chest tightened with every word. Here was a child who had known nothing but anderment, yet carried himself with dignity. "Why do you dance?" David asked. Taye's answer was simple. "When you're hungry, your body feels heavy. If you just sit, hunger wins. But if you move, if you dance, it feels lighter.
and people see you. Even if they don't give anything, at least I'm not invisible." David swallowed hard. He had studied at the world's best schools, dined in the finest restaurants, traveled first class across continents. Yet this boy, with no shoes and no roof over his head, had learned a truth deeper than anything he had encountered. Joy was strength. "You are not invisible anymore," David said firmly. "From today, you are part of this family." Taye blinked, unable to believe the words. But when Zuri wheeled herself closer and grabbed his hand with a radiant smile, he realized it was true. For the first time in his life, he belonged. The transformation did not stay confined within the mansion walls. The story of David, Zuri, and Taye rippled across Lagos, dividing opinion but touching hearts. Some still mocked David as reckless, but many more admired him as courageous. Neighbors whispered differently now. "Imagine, a boy from the streets is helping Amanda walk again. Maybe kindness is richer than money." Business associates who once warned him to abandon the boy found themselves silenced by Zuri's progress. David responded calmly whenever challenged. "My daughter is walking again. That is the only image I care about." And in time, Taye's presence at the Okoro home became ordinary. He no longer entered nervously through the gate, but walked in openly, greeted by staff who treated him with warmth. He slept in a soft bed, ate 3 meals a day, and for the first time in his life went to school. But he never stopped dancing. Every afternoon he still performed in the garden, still laughed with Zuri, still carried the joy that had saved them both. One evening, as the sun set low behind Lagos Lagoon, David stood in the garden watching his daughter take careful steps across the grass. Taye held her hand, steadying her. Her laughter rang out, strong and free. David's chest swelled with emotion. For years he had thought wealth meant the number in his bank account, the size of his estate, the reach of his empire. But in that moment, watching Zuri walk, hearing her laugh, and seeing the boy who had given her hope, he understood what true wealth was. It was not oil. It was not shipping or real estate. It was love. It was kindness. It was family. "I thought I had everything, but I had nothing until I met this boy." From that day, David Okoro was no longer known only as one of Lagos's richest men. He became known as a man of heart. And Taye was no longer the homeless boy who danced for coins. He was a son, a brother, a beacon of hope. The Okoro mansion was no longer just a house of marble and glass. It was a home.